The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan valley as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her radio equipment one final time. She had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Kelso for 8 months, coordinating medical evacuations and supply drops with deadly precision. At 28 years old, she was one of the youngest flight coordination officers in her unit, but her track record spoke volumes about her capabilities. Sarah's reputation had been built through countless successful missions. She could calculate flight paths in her head while under enemy fire, coordinate multiple aircraft simultaneously, and had never lost a pilot under her watch. Her fellow soldiers respected her calm demeanor under pressure and her uncanny ability to find solutions when situations seemed impossible. The base buzzed with unusual activity that Tuesday morning. Intelligence reports indicated a significant Taliban presence moving through the region. Several remote outposts had gone silent overnight, and reconnaissance flights suggested coordinated attacks were imminent. Sarah's commanding officer, Colonel Richards, called an emergency briefing for all senior staff. "We have multiple situations developing simultaneously," Colonel Richards announced to the gathered officers. His weathered face showed the strain of command in one of Afghanistan's most volatile regions. "3 of our forward positions have reported heavy contact. We need immediate medical evacuation for wounded personnel and emergency resupply for units running low on ammunition." Sarah studied the tactical map spread across the briefing table. The requested evacuation points were scattered across treacherous terrain, some in areas where helicopter landings would be extremely dangerous. She quickly calculated flight times, fuel requirements, and potential alternate landing zones. Her mind worked like a computer, processing dozens of variables simultaneously. "Ma'am, I can coordinate the medical evacuations," Sarah volunteered, already sketching preliminary flight paths on her notepad. "If we use the northern approach for the first 2 sites and come in low through the river valley for the 3rd position, we can minimize exposure to enemy fire." Colonel Richards nodded approvingly. Sarah's tactical thinking had saved lives before. "Make it happen, Captain. You'll have 2 Black Hawks and a Chinook at your disposal. Priority is getting our wounded soldiers to medical treatment." Within 30 minutes, Sarah was in the command center, surrounded by radio equipment and computer screens displaying real-time battlefield information. She established communication with the 3 helicopter crews and began coordinating the complex mission. Each pilot trusted her judgment completely, knowing that her calculations and timing had never failed them. The first evacuation went smoothly. Sarah guided the Black Hawk through a safe corridor she had identified using satellite imagery and current intelligence reports. The wounded soldiers were extracted without incident, and the aircraft returned to base for the next phase of the mission. However, as the second helicopter approached its target, Sarah noticed something troubling on her radar screen. Multiple aircraft signatures were appearing from the east, moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested hostile intent. These weren't friendly forces, and they were approaching fast. "Phoenix 2-7, this is base control," Sarah transmitted urgently. "I'm showing multiple unknown aircraft approaching your position from the east. Recommend immediate evasive maneuvers and return to base." The pilot's voice crackled through static. "Base control, we have wounded on board who need immediate medical attention. Can you confirm the nature of the approaching aircraft?" Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up additional sensor data. The signatures were consistent with enemy helicopters, likely armed and looking for targets of opportunity. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but her training kicked in automatically. "Phoenix 2-7, confirmed hostile aircraft. I'm vectoring friendly air support to your location. Maintain current heading but reduce altitude to 500 feet. There's a narrow canyon ahead that will provide cover." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah orchestrated one of the most complex aerial operations of her career. She guided the medical evacuation helicopter through terrain that most pilots would consider impossible to navigate safely, while simultaneously coordinating fighter aircraft to engage the enemy helicopters. Her calm voice over the radio provided confidence to pilots who were flying in extremely dangerous conditions. The wounded soldiers were successfully evacuated, and the enemy aircraft were driven off by the responding fighter jets. Sarah's quick thinking and precise coordination had turned what could have been a disaster into another successful mission. But the day was far from over. As afternoon approached, Sarah received an urgent communication that would test every skill she had developed during her military career. A special operations team had been inserted deep behind enemy lines 3 days earlier. Their mission had been compromised, and they were now surrounded by hostile forces with limited ammunition and no clear extraction route. The team's location was in mountainous terrain where normal helicopter operations were nearly impossible. High altitude, unpredictable weather, and heavy enemy presence made any rescue attempt extremely hazardous. Several previous extraction attempts had been called off due to the dangerous conditions. Sarah studied every piece of available intelligence about the trapped team's location. She analyzed weather patterns, studied topographical maps, and calculated the performance limitations of available aircraft at high altitude. The situation seemed hopeless, but she refused to accept that conclusion. "Colonel, I think I can get them out," Sarah announced during the evening briefing. "It will require perfect timing and some unconventional approaches, but it's possible." Colonel Richards looked skeptical. "Captain, we've already had 2 extraction attempts fail. The terrain is simply too dangerous for standard helicopter operations." Sarah spread her detailed calculations across the table. "Sir, if we wait for optimal weather conditions and use a modified approach pattern, we can reach them. The key is using the terrain features to mask our approach and extraction." The room fell silent as the other officers studied her proposal. What Sarah was suggesting had never been attempted in such hostile territory. The margin for error was practically non-existent, and failure would likely result in the loss of both the rescue aircraft and the trapped soldiers. After several minutes of intense discussion, Colonel Richards made his decision. "Captain Martinez, you have authorization to coordinate the extraction mission." "God help us all." Sarah spent the entire night refining her plan. She studied satellite imagery frame by frame, looking for every possible advantage. She calculated fuel consumption rates, analyzed wind patterns, and identified multiple backup plans for various contingencies. By dawn, she had developed what she believed was their best chance of bringing the special operations team home alive. The rescue mission was scheduled for late afternoon when atmospheric conditions would be most favorable. Sarah would be coordinating from the command center, guiding the rescue helicopter through one of the most challenging flights ever attempted in the Afghan theater of operations. As the appointed time approached, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her during high-stakes operations. She had done everything possible to prepare for success. Now it was time to execute the mission and bring her fellow soldiers home safely. The helicopter crew assigned to the mission was among the most experienced in the unit. They had complete confidence in Sarah's abilities and were prepared to follow her guidance into extremely dangerous territory. The aircraft had been modified for high-altitude operations and carried extra fuel for the extended flight time required. Sarah established communication with the rescue aircraft as it lifted off from the base. "Rescue 1, this is base control. Weather conditions are optimal for the next 4 hours. You are cleared for mission execution." The helicopter disappeared into the afternoon sky, beginning what would become one of the most challenging rescue operations in military history. Sarah watched the aircraft's progress on her tracking systems, ready to provide the guidance and support that would determine whether the mission succeeded or ended in tragedy. Unknown to Sarah, this mission would test not only her professional skills but also her personal courage in ways she had never imagined. The next few hours would prove that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the people holding weapons, but by those who guide others through the darkness when hope seems lost. The radio crackled to life as the rescue helicopter reported its position. Sarah took a deep breath and began what would become the most important mission of her military career. Everything she had learned, every skill she had developed, and every ounce of courage she possessed would be needed in the hours ahead. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Afghan mountains as Sarah prepared to guide her fellow soldiers into harm's way, knowing that their lives depended on her ability to make the right decisions under extreme pressure. The real test of her character was about to begin. The rescue helicopter climbed steadily through the thin mountain air as Sarah monitored its progress from the command center. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Thompson was piloting the Black Hawk, accompanied by co-pilot Lieutenant Maria Santos and a four-man rescue team. Sarah had worked with this crew before and knew their capabilities intimately. "Base control, we're approaching checkpoint Alpha," Thompson's voice reported through the radio. "Visibility is good, but we're getting some turbulence from the mountain winds." Sarah checked her weather displays and confirmed that conditions were within acceptable parameters. "Roger, Rescue 1. Continue on current heading. The trap team should be approximately 12 clicks northeast of your position." The Special Operations Team, callsign Phantom Squad, had been conducting reconnaissance on enemy supply routes when their position was compromised. Sergeant Major David Chen led the five-man team, all veterans with extensive combat experience. They had been evading enemy forces for 3 days, moving through terrain that offered little cover and no easy escape routes. Sarah had been in contact with Chen throughout their ordeal, coordinating supply drops and providing intelligence updates. His team was running low on ammunition and had 2 wounded members who needed immediate medical attention. Time was running out. "Base control, this is Phantom Leader," Chen's voice came through an encrypted channel. "We can hear aircraft approaching from the south." "Are you our ride home?" Sarah smiled despite the tension. Chen's dry humor had kept his team's morale up during their dangerous situation. "Affirm, Phantom Leader. Rescue 1 is approximately 10 minutes from your position. Are you ready for extraction?" "We've been ready since yesterday," Chen replied. "But, be advised, we have enemy movement in the valley below our position. Looks like they're trying to surround us." Sarah immediately switched to the rescue helicopter's frequency. "Rescue 1, be advised that enemy forces are active in the target area. Phantom Squad reports movement in the valley below their position." Thompson acknowledged the warning. Flying into a potential ambush was exactly what they had trained for, but it never became routine. Every rescue operation in hostile territory carried enormous risks for both the aircrew and the soldiers they were trying to save. As the Black Hawk approached the extraction site, Sarah used satellite imagery to track enemy movement patterns. She could see groups of fighters moving through the valleys, apparently trying to locate the trapped American team. The window for a successful extraction was rapidly closing. "Rescue 1, I'm showing multiple enemy groups converging on the target area," Sarah transmitted. "Recommend approach from the northwest using the ridgeline for cover." Thompson adjusted his flight path according to Sarah's guidance. The helicopter dropped low, using the mountainous terrain to mask its approach. Sarah watched the aircraft's progress on her screens, calculating intercept courses and timing the approach to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The extraction site was a small clearing on a ridge approximately 8,000 feet above sea level. At this altitude, the helicopter's performance was significantly reduced, making precise flying even more critical. Thompson would have only one chance to land, load the team, and take off before enemy forces could respond. "Phantom Leader, Rescue 1 is 2 minutes out," Sarah announced. "Prepare for immediate pickup. You'll have approximately 60 seconds on the ground." Chen's team had prepared for this moment. They had moved to the predetermined landing zone and established a defensive perimeter. The 2 wounded soldiers were ready for transport, and the team's equipment had been consolidated for quick loading. As the Black Hawk crested the final ridge, Thompson could see the small clearing ahead. It was barely large enough for the helicopter, with steep terrain on all sides. Landing would require perfect precision in the thin mountain air. "Base control, I have visual on the landing zone," Thompson reported. "Beginning final approach." Sarah monitored multiple communication channels simultaneously, tracking the helicopter's approach while maintaining contact with Phantom Squad and listening for any enemy radio transmissions that intelligence might intercept. Every second counted in this type of operation. The Black Hawk touched down in the clearing with Thompson demonstrating the skill that had made him one of the unit's most trusted pilots. Before the aircraft had fully settled, Chen's team was moving toward the helicopter. The wounded soldiers were loaded first, followed by the rest of the equipment and personnel. "Rescue 1, all personnel on board," Chen reported as the last team member climbed into the aircraft. "We're ready for departure." Thompson pulled collective and began lifting off from the confined landing zone. However, as the helicopter climbed above the ridgeline, Sarah noticed new radar contacts appearing on her screen. Enemy aircraft were approaching from multiple directions, and they were closing fast. "Rescue 1, you have multiple bogies approaching from the east and south," Sarah transmitted urgently. "Recommend immediate evasive action and maximum power climb." The Black Hawk's engines roared as Thompson pushed the aircraft to its performance limits. At this altitude, every pound of weight and every degree of temperature affected the helicopter's ability to climb and maneuver. With a full load of passengers and equipment, options were limited. Sarah's mind raced through possible escape routes. The helicopter needed to reach friendly territory, but enemy aircraft were positioned to intercept any direct route back to base. She would need to guide Thompson through terrain that would provide cover while allowing the heavily loaded Black Hawk to maintain sufficient airspeed. "Rescue 1, turn left heading 270 and descend into the river valley," Sarah instructed. "Use the terrain masking to avoid detection." Thompson followed Sarah's guidance, dropping the helicopter into a narrow valley between towering peaks. Flying at high speed through confined terrain required exceptional skill, especially with limited visibility as evening shadows deepened across the mountains. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah guided the rescue helicopter through a maze of valleys and canyons, constantly adjusting course to avoid enemy aircraft and ground-based threats. Her knowledge of the terrain and ability to predict enemy movement patterns kept the Black Hawk one step ahead of pursuing forces. However, as they approached what should have been friendly territory, Sarah received devastating news. The main base had come under heavy attack. Enemy forces had launched a coordinated assault using rockets and mortars, making helicopter landings extremely dangerous. "Rescue 1, be advised that primary landing site is under attack," Sarah announced. "I'm vectoring you to alternate landing zone Bravo." The alternate site was a smaller base located in a valley 20 miles south of their original destination. It had limited medical facilities, but it was currently secure and could handle helicopter operations. The problem was that the detour would require additional fuel that the Black Hawk might not have. Thompson checked his fuel gauges and performed quick calculations. "Base control, we're getting close to minimum fuel reserves." "What's the distance to alternate LZ?" Sarah had already calculated the numbers. 18 miles at your current position. You should have sufficient fuel if we maintain current power settings. The flight to the alternate landing zone took them over terrain that Sarah had never worked before. She was operating from maps and satellite imagery, without the detailed local knowledge that had made their earlier escape possible. Every decision carried enormous risk. As the Black Hawk approached the alternate base, Sarah could see that the situation was more complicated than initially reported. The landing zone was partially obscured by smoke from a nearby vehicle fire, and radio chatter indicated possible enemy infiltration in the area. "Rescue 1, the LZ appears to be compromised," Sarah transmitted. "Stand by while I coordinate with ground forces." Sarah quickly established contact with the base commander and confirmed that the landing zone was secure despite the apparent confusion. Ground forces had repelled an enemy probe, but the base was still operational and could receive the wounded soldiers. Thompson brought the Black Hawk in for landing as fuel gauges showed critically low levels. The rescue mission had succeeded, but barely. Sarah's guidance and coordination had made the difference between success and catastrophe. As the wounded soldiers were transferred to medical personnel, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The mission had tested every aspect of her training and experience. However, her satisfaction was short-lived. A new crisis was developing that would require all of her skills and more courage than she had ever demonstrated before. Intelligence reports were coming in about a situation that could affect the entire region, and Sarah would find herself at the center of events that would determine the fate of hundreds of soldiers and civilians. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from headquarters. Sarah's work was far from finished, and the most challenging part of her career was just beginning. 3 weeks after the successful rescue mission, Sarah found herself facing a career-defining moment that would test everything she had learned about leadership, courage, and making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. Intelligence reports indicated that a major enemy offensive was planned for the following day, targeting multiple coalition bases simultaneously across the region. The enemy had learned from previous defeats and was coordinating their attacks with unprecedented sophistication. Communications intercepts suggested that they knew the locations of key personnel and planned to target command and control centers specifically. Sarah's command post was on the target list. Colonel Richards called an emergency meeting of senior staff as reports continued to pour in from intelligence sources. The situation was unlike anything they had faced before. Enemy forces had positioned themselves to attack from multiple directions, using terrain features to mask their movement until the last possible moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we're facing a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm our defenses, Colonel Richards announced grimly. Intelligence suggests they plan to hit us with everything they have. Our mission is to coordinate the defense while maintaining essential operations. Sarah studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. The enemy plan was sophisticated and showed detailed knowledge of coalition force deployments. They had identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited to devastating effect. Traditional defensive measures might not be sufficient. Sir, if I may, Sarah interrupted, pointing to key locations on the tactical map. Their plan depends on preventing us from coordinating air support between bases. If we can maintain communication links and coordinate our aviation assets effectively, we can turn their coordination against them. The room fell silent as officers considered Sarah's analysis. She was proposing to use the enemy's own tactics against them by creating a unified air defense network that could respond to attacks across the entire region. It was ambitious and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and perfect communication. Colonel Richards looked skeptical. Captain, what you're suggesting has never been attempted on this scale. The coordination requirements alone would be staggering. Sarah had already worked through the details in her mind. Sir, we have the communication equipment and the personnel. The key is establishing redundant networks so that losing any single command post doesn't collapse the entire system. I can coordinate from here while establishing backup control centers at 3 other locations. Over the next 12 hours, Sarah worked with communication technicians to establish the most sophisticated military communication network ever deployed in the Afghan theater. Multiple command centers were linked through encrypted channels, with backup systems and alternate frequencies prepared for every possible scenario. As dawn approached, Sarah positioned herself in the primary command center, surrounded by radio equipment and computer screens displaying real-time information from across the region. She had teams at backup locations ready to take over if the main facility was compromised. The attack began at precisely 6 a.m. with rocket strikes against 3 coalition bases simultaneously. Sarah's communication network immediately proved its value as she coordinated air support between locations, vectoring attack helicopters and fighter aircraft to where they were needed most. All stations, this is base control, Sarah transmitted over the unified network. We have multiple attacks in progress. Aviation assets are being dispatched according to priority targets. Maintain communication discipline and report status every 5 minutes. For the next 3 hours, Sarah orchestrated the most complex air defense operation of her career. She tracked dozens of aircraft simultaneously, coordinated ammunition resupply for bases under attack, and guided medical evacuation flights through active combat zones. Her calm voice over the radio provided confidence to personnel across the region. However, at 9:30 that morning, enemy forces launched a direct assault on Sarah's command post. Rocket-propelled grenades struck the communications building, knocking out primary power and damaging several radio systems. Smoke filled the command center as backup generators struggled to maintain essential systems. Base control, this is Delta 7, came an urgent transmission from one of the outlying bases. We're under heavy attack and need immediate air support. Do you copy? Sarah's primary radio had been damaged in the attack, but backup systems were still functional. Despite the chaos around her, she maintained her position and continued coordinating the regional defense. Delta 7, this is base control. Air support is en route to your position. ETA 4 minutes. The command center shook as another explosion rocked the building. Sarah could hear small arms fire outside as base defense forces engaged enemy infiltrators who had penetrated the perimeter. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but abandoning her post would leave multiple bases without coordination support. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, Sarah's chief radio operator, looked at her with concern. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate to the backup command post. This position is becoming untenable." Sarah glanced around the damaged command center. Several radio systems were still operational, and she had critical missions in progress that required her immediate attention. Moving to the backup location would take precious time that could cost lives at other bases. "Negative, Sergeant. We maintain position until I can transfer active missions to the backup site." Sarah keyed her radio and continued coordinating air support for 3 separate bases that were under simultaneous attack. Outside the building, the sound of gunfire was getting closer. Base security forces were fighting a determined enemy assault, but Sarah knew that her position could be overrun at any moment. Still, she refused to abandon her post while soldiers at other locations depended on her coordination. At 10:15, an explosion much closer than the others knocked out the remaining primary communication equipment. Sarah switched to a portable radio system, maintaining contact with aviation assets even as the building around her filled with smoke and debris. "All stations, this is base control," Sarah transmitted over the emergency frequency. "Primary command post is under direct assault. Transferring coordination to backup location in 3 minutes. Continue current missions until further notice." Sarah and her team gathered essential equipment and prepared to move to the backup command post. However, as they prepared to leave the building, Torres reported that enemy forces had surrounded the communications facility. They were trapped. "Ma'am, we have enemy fighters positioned between us and the backup location," Torres reported grimly. "Looks like they specifically targeted our facility to disrupt regional communications." Sarah realized that the enemy had identified her command post as a critical node in the coalition defense network. By eliminating her coordination capability, they could significantly degrade the effectiveness of air support across the entire region. The attack on her facility wasn't random, it was a carefully planned operation. "Torres, get on the emergency radio and notify all stations that we're switching to contingency protocol," Sarah ordered. "Each base will coordinate their own air support until we can re-establish regional control." As Sarah transmitted final coordination instructions, she could hear enemy forces breaching the outer defenses of the communications building. Base security forces were fighting desperately, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Then, through the smoke and noise of battle, Sarah heard a sound that changed everything: the distinctive rotor noise of an approaching Black Hawk helicopter. The aircraft was flying extremely low and fast, approaching the base from an unexpected direction. "Base control, this is Rescue 1, came Thompson's familiar voice over the radio. "We're en route to your position for immediate extraction. Mark your location with smoke." Sarah grabbed a smoke grenade and threw it through a broken window. Green smoke billowed from the device, marking their position for the incoming helicopter. Thompson's crew had somehow penetrated enemy air defenses to reach her trap team. The Black Hawk appeared over the communications building, hovering in a small courtyard while enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Thompson held the aircraft steady despite the hostile fire, demonstrating the same skill and courage that had made previous rescue missions successful. "Move! Move! Move!" Sarah shouted to her team as they ran toward the hovering helicopter. Torres and the other radio operators grabbed essential equipment and followed Sarah through the smoke-filled courtyard. As the team boarded the Black Hawk, Sarah maintained radio contact with bases across the region, continuing to coordinate air support even during her own extraction. Her dedication to mission completion impressed the aircrew, who were risking their lives to rescue her team. Thompson lifted off from the compound as enemy fire intensified. The Black Hawk climbed rapidly, using the same terrain masking techniques that Sarah had guided other aircraft through during previous missions. Within minutes, they were safely away from the compromised command post. "Base control, this is Rescue 1, Thompson announced over the radio. Package is secure and en route to alternate location. Sarah immediately established communication with the backup command center and resumed coordination of the regional air defense network. Despite the enemy's attempt to disrupt coalition communications, her contingency planning had worked. The defense network remained operational, and air support continued to flow to bases under attack. By afternoon, the coordinated enemy offensive had been defeated. Coalition air power, guided by Sarah's communication network, had broken up attack formations and forced enemy forces to withdraw. The sophisticated enemy plan had failed because Sarah's coordination capability had proven more resilient than anticipated. 3 months later, Sarah received notification that she had been selected for promotion to major and assignment to the Pentagon, where she would help develop new communication and coordination protocols based on her battlefield innovations. Her techniques were being studied and implemented throughout military aviation commands worldwide. However, the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers whose lives had been saved by her coordination efforts. Letters from across the region thanked her for her courage under fire and her refusal to abandon her post when other bases needed her support. Colonel Richards presented Sarah with the Bronze Star Medal during a ceremony at the main base. Captain Martinez has demonstrated that sometimes the most important courage is shown not by those who charge into battle, but by those who stay at their posts and guide others through the darkness. As Sarah prepared to leave Afghanistan for her new assignment, she reflected on the lessons learned during her deployment. Military technology and tactics would continue to evolve, but the fundamental principles of leadership under pressure would remain constant. Success still depended on individuals who were willing to make difficult decisions and stand by them when lives were at stake. The morning she departed for the United States, Sarah took one final look at the communications equipment that had enabled her to coordinate life-saving missions across the region. Her replacement, a young lieutenant fresh from training, would carry on the mission with the same dedication and professionalism. As her transport aircraft lifted off from the base, Sarah knew that her time in Afghanistan had changed her permanently. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was necessary despite being afraid. Leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about making the best decisions possible with available information and taking responsibility for the consequences. The aircraft climbed into the clear morning sky, carrying Sarah toward new challenges and opportunities. Behind her, she left a legacy of innovation, courage, and dedication that would influence military operations for years to come. Her story had become proof that sometimes the most important victories are won not by those who fire the shots, but by those who guide others safely home when hope seems lost.